Well, it's 11 o'clock, and I think it's time to get started. So again, thank you everyone for being able to join in this session where we're going to be talking about depolicing of biking. And so first off, I just wanted to be able to share a little bit. Again, my name is Poncho Guevara. I am proud to be a board member of SVBC and also be the executive director of Sacred Heart Community Service here in San Jose. But I want to just get us started by first introducing our panelists and then we're gonna launch into some questions because there's a lot of important information about how we think about our work. But first off, I want to introduce Daryl Owens as a housing and transportation advocate from Berkeley. His activism focuses on traffic safety and eliminating police from traffic enforcement. Second, Tamisha Walker, Executive Director of Safe Return Project, an organization invested in securing the freedom of formerly incarcerated and convicted individuals. She has been a community organizer and advocate on issues related to mass incarceration and racial disparity in the criminal justice system since her release from incarceration in 2009. And Chiamaka Ogwuegbu is from Hyattsville, Maryland. He lives in Oakland, California, and he serves as executive projects analyst for the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. And he focuses on racial equity initiatives, agency-wide policy, and special executive projects. Chiamaka is dedicated to creating transportation systems that bring society closer to meeting everyone's basic needs in a way that centers marginalized people and our health. Well, why are we here today? I'm going to throw out I'll just start out with a little personal anecdote because I've been reflecting on why are we actually having this conversation today, why this is really important. Growing up in Santa Clara and Sunnyvale myself, I remember the profound freedom, joy, and fear associated with cycling growing up. Like many folks, riding my bike let me explore and connect with my community, my family, and friends. Was my primary means of transportation to and from school and work, and facilitated my exploration and love of nature, riding in the hills and to county parks here in this community. It was also a source of genuine fear when my friends and I would be frequently stopped, questioned, verbally assaulted, and even forcibly detained by law enforcement. As a Chicano kid growing up in a white suburbia, I accepted it as a frustrating fact of life. Conversations with my white friends reinforced that they almost never had any negative interactions with law enforcement, and when they did, it was usually pretty swift and even cordial. But the experience of my brown friends was very different. I developed a genuine fear for my health and safety. I felt humiliated, ashamed, and fearful of police rather than some sense of safety and purpose of these interactions. And later I realized that the experience of other friends, especially Black and brown ones, necessitated the talk, where parents, especially of Black children, needed to understand that those interactions could not only be unnecessary, stressful, and inconvenient, but lethal. That doesn't even begin to touch on the differences between the conditions of streets and sidewalks from north and east side communities versus the west side communities. These types of things were endemic to our experiences. But given that context, our society is living through a moment where we are starting to interrogate how and why we order our society, how white supremacy is insinuated into our beliefs, our policies, and our systems as evidenced by the differential treatment of people of color, and in particular, the role of law enforcement in the status quo. So given that context, our goals for today are really to give the opportunity for our distinguished panel to give some updates on efforts to advance alternatives to policing, decriminalizing biking and walking, and decreasing the impact of policing on BIPOC communities. We hope to explore how Bay Area cities are working to find alternatives to policing, as well as other kinds of advocacy related to traffic enforcement. So we want to welcome everyone to this conversation. It's a very important and timely one. But most importantly, I just wanted to say thank you to the Bicycle Coalition for making sure that we're having this space for this dialogue. It's an important, timely one. And given what's going to be happening for a reimagining of public safety process in San Jose, I'm eager to actually learn from the expertise on this panel. But we're going to start out with you, Chiamaka. Can you share a little bit about, if you could share just a teeny bit about how you came to this work and why this is important to you, and what is happening now to reimagine how we approach these issues?
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, kind of framing the purpose of the space. And thank you so much to Silicon Valley Coalition for kind of hosting this and having us. I think in terms of that first question that you mentioned about how I came to this work and why it's important, I think one way that I always frame, my approach to justice, my approach to to communities that, I cannot fully rest and fully be happy while others are suffering. I think that kind of framing really resonates in this context when we talk about our approach to, our approach to transportation, specifically traffic safety, like as is the focus of this conversation. It's you see a lot of interesting dynamics play out where, in the context of safety and security at large in our communities, traffic safety plays a large role in that. And we see that, when it comes to the folks who see the highest volumes of injuries, of unsafe driving behaviors within their community, it's just disproportionately Black folks, brown folks, folks at all points of marginalization. And I think the sensitive dynamic that we have to balance is that we can't, in addressing traffic safety inequities that we see on a daily basis, we can't perpetuate or create new inequities. And so I think, and specifically when I think about my purpose and approach to the topic, it's really about centering both the local experiences of Black folks within the Bay Area, within Oakland, within San Francisco, when it comes to making these decisions about how we're going to approach traffic safety, traffic enforcement, Vision Zero within the Bay Area, and also really kind of recognizing and centering the racist outcomes that we know are associated with policing. I always say that when we lead with policing, inequities always follow. And so kind of being real and frank about the stop outcome disparities that we see, the connection between leading with policing on the ground and what that means for the prison industrial complex on the back end, the real and observed and felt mental, emotional, and physical impacts of an approach to enforcement that leads with policing. And so I think that's kind of like a rough and loose kind of framing of how I think about the work and its importance. And I think at a macro level, it's really about kind of centering justice and all the work that we, and always asking the question of what the just outcome looks like in any given context. And I think that's how I approach this question. And did you also ask that I kind of provide a little bit of context about my work as well beyond the general framing, Poncho?
I love talking when we're muted. So yeah, what's working? I mean, talk a little bit about it, because we had a conversation earlier, and you're talking about like a way of really measuring the effectiveness of what's going on. And there's some really exciting work to understand and interrogate how our systems can be changed and transformed. But yeah, dive into that.
For sure. And so the context that I'm most familiar with, so I'm an Oakland resident. I'm here in Fruitvale on School Street right now, but also work for the city of San Francisco. So I kind of have feet on both sides of the Bay. And I spent a lot of time over the last several months, like half a year, working within Oakland's reimagining public safety process and spending a ton of time focusing on that question of what it looks like to disarm or reimagine traffic enforcement. And so myself, and I think Dave Campbell and some other folks who are on this call, worked on kind of thinking through the implications of that approach and like landed on a couple of tenets that kind of guided our work. Number one, kind of working towards solutions that kind of touch three bases. Number one, are they equitable? Do they address, or I guess maybe like scaling back a little bit, recognizing that within an open context, there are real documented disparities when it comes to trafficking. I think the one of the numbers that stuck out to me was that in a city where the Black population is about 23% of the city, Black folks make up about, I think, 50% of the traffic violation stops in the city. And that's just like one of many numbers that you can pull out that kind of speaks to those connections, as well as the sort of racialized harm piece that I spoke to earlier. And then number two, is it actually effective? You see within Oakland and also within San Francisco, really, and I'm sure this holds with cities across the Bay Area, that despite years of status quo investment, a status quo approach, you don't really see dropping numbers when it comes to collisions, injuries, crashes, deaths, all of the key metrics that folks cite when they talk about traffic safety. You don't really see the alignment between that investment and the outcomes that we're seeing on the street. And then number three, is it efficient? I think all of you know that policing is very costly. I think the number that comes to mind is it's about like $200,000 salary and fringe for police officers in our communities. Maybe it depends city by city. I don't know. Some of my colleagues might know the number better than I do. That's really inefficient, honestly, for an enforcement or compliance paradigm where the vast majority of stops don't result in, they're usually not violent, nor do they result in a level of risk that really merits an armed police officer, given the specialized training, equipment, et cetera, that they need. And so the Oakland recommendation really focused on a couple key tenets. Number one, moving like the traffic compliance function or the majority of it from the police department to OPDOT recognizing that that's not something that we're completely empowered to do at the local level, and that would require state intervention to make that legal, but kind of asking the city to send the message and set the precedent that that's something that we want and that we were willing to advocate for and work with our state legislators for. And beyond that, it also focused on moving a lot of other transportation functions that are sneakily, that have been sneakily housed in the police department, like I think towing, collision investigation, crossing guards, and really moving those to a home that makes a lot more sense. And so that was kind of the thrust of the recommendation. And I think most saliently, it was informative to see how challenging that debate was at the local level from folks who were clear and direct with their call for the need to defund and kind of divorce ourselves from the mentality of policing, but also apprehension about, you know, the efficacy of traffic compliance that's not housed in a department that has the traditional authority, the traditional ethos that the police department maybe has, and also reticence to kind of entrust that key safety need when people weren't seeing proven models or models that they trusted or data that they trusted. And so kind of navigating that debate at the local level was pretty tricky. And where that work is in Oakland now, to my recollection, is that so the council approved or prioritized that traffic enforcement recommendation as, I think, a suite of a dozen that were prioritized for action and for follow-up and for incorporation into the current biennial budget. And OCDOT staff are also working within their safe open streets paradigm to explore those recommendations and work with OPD to see what's possible and kind of analyze the cost and operational implications. And I'll actually maybe before I'll pause, I'm going to get to San Francisco's work because I know I've been talking for a while, so I want to make space for other panelists. Thank you, Poncho.
No, thank you, Chiamaka. We're gonna come back to you, and one of the things I'm gonna follow up with you about what are some of those things that are working, but also barriers to actually change. But before we do so, I want to go to Tamisha. If you could share a little bit about, again, the context in which you're coming to this work, and what is happening to reimagining these issues in your work.
Can everyone hear me? Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, this discussion. I feel like I just learned a lot from the last panelist, so I'm like, what is there left to say? It's like, he just summed up the whole, we can all go home now. I think that Tamisha Walker, co-founder, executive director of Safe Return Project in Contra Costa County. I come to this work as a formerly incarcerated convicted person. Really, the work that Safe Return does is direct investment in individuals impacted by the criminal legal system, as well as using participatory action research to drive justice reinvestment strategies and policy advocacy at the local, state, and national level. And it's so important, what I found, like just coming into this work as a disenfranchised person myself, was really learning about like structural institutional racism, but not just that, but also how systems are not set up to actually work for us. So most of what our people do are navigate within systems that aren't set up for us to be successful. And therefore we battle really hard and then we give up. And so some of what Safe Return does is using story, research, and people's personal experience to be able to transform some of these systems, but then also understanding that we're not going to legislate our way out of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. So then also talking about, well, what is the investment in community that could get us to a point where we no longer need to lean so heavily on these systems like the system of policing. And so conversations around like what does public safety actually mean and how it doesn't really equal police, and that why we have so much disparity in our community is because the things that really make us safe do not exist, like access to affordable housing, jobs, healthy food options, walkability, upward mobility, things of that nature. So I think for myself, just looking at my personal experience and using, all of the tools that we have as community researchers to help our communities kind of like think through these issues, and then how do we kind of organize and mobilize people on the ground based on their collective interest around like, okay, where do we go from here? And this has been like, this is not a new conversation, especially for Richmond. And it's actually not a new conversation for Contra Costa County, which was one of the first counties in the state of California to actually redirect AB 109 funds into reentry programs before any other county, right? And I think that we have always been trying to reimagine these systems in Contra Costa. And so now what we kind of do is help our communities on the ground think about it. So the investment is really not grass tops, but really grassroots, and trying to make sure that those who are most impacted are the ones doing the work. When I think about policing in general, some of the challenges that we really don't talk about in these spaces is how people of color, Black people, brown people, we not the great majority, because I don't want to generalize, all feel safe with the police, right? Like not all of us, but there have been conversations during the reimagining public safety process where when we're trying to say we need to redirect funds, we need to stop aggressive traffic enforcement, we need to stop criminalizing people who are unhoused, you have our elders and our folks in the community coming out and saying like, look, we want the police, they make us feel safe, which then gets us to the conversations that we're not having, is like how historically we've relegated our safety to policing in such a way where we in our communities cannot come together and make a decision that, well, police actually don't make us feel safe, these other things make us feel safe, and how do we work together to get there? My personal experience around like traffic enforcement, it's a racket, like all of these issues. And it's weird because when you mention like towing, like I did some math, and by the time an individual will get a vehicle back, whether it's a car, a bike, or whatever, because they decide that they can impound a bicycle, it blows my mind, right? But they'll only take a certain kind of individual's bicycle, but you could spend up to $3,000 just trying. It blew my mind to get a bicycle back. You could just you might just go buy another bicycle, and really just some of our communities don't have bike lanes. A lot of our communities that haven't had the investment in infrastructure don't have bike lanes. So then you have young people who want to ride, they're riding in the street, and then they get citations, they get tickets, and then they get pulled over. So we also aren't taught, like, we need to address the necessary infrastructure for walkability and biking in some of our communities that do not exist. And then as a result, we're criminalizing young folks and communities for trying to get around successfully. And then personally, my son was ticketed for jaywalking, which was insane to me, like as a 14-year-old on his way to school, crossing the street. And so we actually went to court, drug him through court, and fought a jaywalking ticket when like a handful of young people before him didn't get ticketed, but he was also the tallest, he was also the darkest, right? And so we really felt like he was targeted for actually being Black, and trying to cross the street safely. So there are a lot of ways that we're trying to address these issues. Richmond Reimagining Public Safety process is trying to actually move traffic enforcement out of the police department and looking at Berkeley and Oakland and what folks are doing to see like, how can we make that work in Richmond first? And then figure out these other communities that really need to scale back police doing jobs that we don't think that they should be doing because it continues to further harm our communities.
Thank you, Tamisha. I'm wondering if there are other things that were maybe one or two examples of things that came out of your participatory action research, talking to people that are directly impacted, that you think that maybe you haven't elucidated on thus far, like that we're like, hey, this is the instinct of our community, because there's a lot of expertise in community when we just shut up and listen. Any other thoughts
Yeah.
that came up?
Yeah, so from some of the research that we've done in the community around needs and how, how folks want to like reimagine public safety or move away from the policing, folks have largely said like we need to provide low to no income housing for folks. Like that's a no-brainer. We've all been talking about that, but people in the community have been thinking about it as well. Some of the other things people will have actually talked about, the one of our surveys was community issues. So they, if you look at calls for service, they have what they call like nuisance calls or quality of life calls and all of these things. So community we're talking about, well, what if we had a community response team where we actually don't need the police to address these very minor issues, like young people hanging out, which we say is loitering, but it's really young people hanging out to make sure we aren't criminalizing young folks. So I think some of the like, not basic, because I don't think it's basic for our community, but some of the real basic ideas around like, how do we take back responsibility for safety and relationships in our community is what came out of some of our research. Also, folks really want to see us have a more balanced budget in the city, and how do we continue to move money around in our city to meet some of these other like base needs of folks in our community, and not just the police department's budget, right? Like we could scale that back as much as we want, but there's money that is hidden in counties and cities that we don't talk about in the form of frozen positions that never get filled. How city managers in most cities had an authority to cut checks without the city council's approval. So there's a lot of money that could be moved around, and it's just denied to our folks because we don't understand that process. So a lot of participatory budgeting is what people asked for as well, and we've been doing a lot of that enrichment, and I really accredit it to also some of the work that folks been doing in Oakland that we've been able to learn from.
Thank you, Tamisha. Now I'm going to turn to you, Daryl. Like, what has brought you into this work in the context in which you're actually operating in, and what do you think is happening right now in terms of reimagining how we approach these issues?
So I just want to start off by saying I'm at a resort. So if you hear this obnoxious, I don't know if you can hear this leaf blower. I hope you can't hear that too loud. I'm sorry. Anyways, yeah, so I'm Daryl Owens. I'm a member of East Bay for Everyone. We worked with Walk Bike Berkeley last year to remove police officers from traffic enforcement in Berkeley, California. And that led to a very interesting discussion on the role of policing in transportation and the sort of underlying issues of motorized, militarized, and modern policing. One of the things that's really important to start off with is even the Bureau of Justice Statistics concedes and notes this pretty prominently in their triannual surveys, which is that the vast majority of Americans that interact with police officers do so through car-based traffic stops. In 2015, it was about 67% of all people who were stopped by police or ever interacted with a police officer did so through a traffic stop. I believe in the recent 2018 survey, it's the annual one-year survey, it's about 56%. And that includes everything from police officers pulling people over to people getting into car accidents, needing to call the police. All things that numerous studies have shown are not necessary to be in police's jurisdiction. Police traffic stops are very non-dangerous towards police officers. There was a longitudinal 10-year study done in Florida, which found that like 1 out of a million or more traffic stops result in a police officer even being assaulted. It's just very uncommon, contrary to what a lot of police unions will tell people, that traffic policing is some dangerous activity that requires a gun. It doesn't. And studies are almost unanimous on this subject. So we did that initiative in Berkeley to remove police officers from traffic stops. It is problematic though, because state law mandates that only peace officers, which is police officers, can do traffic stops. And so that's pretty frustrating. But there are practical ways to remove this element from the dangers of traffic stops. For example, an initiative I want to push is demanding that police unions modify their contracts so that traffic divisions are armed, right? Because one of the things that I work for with BART is removing the sort of armed element out of policing. So prior to this traffic enforcement thing, about 2 years ago with East Bay for Everyone, we worked heavily on a program called the BART Ambassador Program, which was an initial attempt in response to a pretty horrific killing at a BART station, that there was this popular demand to increase BART police. Now, I've met the Oscar Grant family. I knew full well that a reactive attempt to just start hiring BART cops to go patrol the stations would almost certainly result in Black folks getting targeted, harassed. It was a pretty transparent attempt by a lot of suburban board members to harass Black kids who dance on the train in Oakland. So we were like, okay, well, how can we stop that from happening? Because there is a problem where people feel like they're sometimes unsafe, but we don't need an armed officer just to be present and make people feel better. And so that's when we thought up the ambassador program. We're still seeing how it's turned out. So far, it seems to be pretty good, but a program where you have people who are unarmed and are visible, not making arrests, is sort of the way to increase public safety. Visibility oftentimes increases public safety. And so going from those lessons, which we learned a lot of lessons in those, going from that into this, we said, okay, well, how can we do this with traffic stops, since it is the vast majority of ways people interact with police? Let's be clear. Even when we remove police officers from traffic stops, and I believe that will happen, even when that happens, that's not the solution to traffic violence. Traffic violence, like gun violence, kills 40,000 people a year, okay? So there's always gonna be popular demand for enforcement, provided we solve the underlying issue, which is why streets are dangerous in the first place, that they even have popular demand for traffic cops. And we have the solutions to reducing traffic deaths to zero. So the spirit of defunding the police, a lot of people somewhat miss this. It's not just about removing police officers for the sake of doing so. It's about investing in solutions so that there's no need for them in the first place. And that's what we need to do with traffic enforcement. And that's what I'm really spearheading here. It's how do we not only remove the danger element from the state in terms of pulling people over, because I'm a cyclist, I'm a pedestrian, I don't drive. And yet I find that, I'm still not in favor of police officers going around and pulling people over. It's just unnecessary. And it's also just a way to commit warrantless stops with frivolous issues. So number one, I want to commend the work that Oakland's done on this in terms of banning pretextual stops. Berkeley has also followed suit. And those are all good ways to get about this. But we need to solve the underlying problem of why our streets are so dangerous. And I know what the solution is. I grew up in East Oakland. And in East Oakland, I couldn't play out on the street. My father said absolutely not, because he knew full well he knew too many kids who got killed stepping out on that street, and some guy just drives right by, hit and run. It wasn't until I moved to a neighborhood in Berkeley where they have traffic diverters on the street, and it was a much safer environment. So curbing the universal movement of cars is crucial to making streets safer, because a lot of Black and brown communities act as just highways for suburban commuters to swoosh right through, and our car centrism reflects that. Meanwhile, you go into a suburb, they make sure they have cul-de-sacs so people can't start speeding all around and killing their kids. This is why traffic fatalities tend to be higher in poorer communities, because that's how our planning has worked to prioritize people going through them at as fast as possible. So it's a two-pronged issue. It's enforcement and it's prevention. And I really heavily try to emphasize both.
Oh, thank you, Darrell. It's a really, really important construct. And I really appreciate the ideas that you've been able to surface and be able to advocate. And I want to kind of return to you, Chiamaka, because like some of the work you're doing in San Francisco, I'm curious about, if there are things that you've picked up on, because obviously the challenge of being able to work on this issue through the lens of traffic enforcement, but connected with what Tamisha was talking about, what it makes our community safer are things about our built environment, not just our built environment and enforcement, but also the quality of life that people have, things like affordable housing and, and jobs and opportunity for folks, and the kind of investment that we're putting into all these infrastructure to respond to these different issues. And I'm curious about, like, even in the context of the planning work that you've been involved in, like, what are the things that have been surfaced, and what is the role of even a siloed organization to be helping to advance change? Simple question, I know.
I was like writing down the 5 parts of that question. Thank you, Poncho. To kind of in full agreement with what Darrell kind of mentioned about like the engineering and the design of the streets kind of being the root of street safety and of traffic safety. And I think, as a bureaucrat, as an SFMTA worker, kind of the challenge that I see my colleagues navigate is how far we are from getting from where we are now to that point B, in terms of the millions of dollars of investment needed, even like, and I guess that's like, the millions you get into like the concrete and some of those longer term investments, but even in thinking about some of the quick build, some of the paint and post work that we do, just like how long it takes to get those projects approved, to do the requisite community engagement, to align the stakeholders that we have in City Hall, the mayor's office, and internally. So I think, I've kind of seen firsthand the scope, scale, and challenge of doing that work at the local level, even thinking about, like a board meeting that we had a couple of weeks ago where our planners were kind of presenting our Vision Zero action strategy and kind of how they saw the next couple of years playing out in terms of our investments, and going back and forth with our board about them not feeling like it was enough, and our staff kind of thinking through the resources that they had available, what the funding looks like locally at the state level and federally, and kind of trying to grapple with that while also meeting the ambitious goal in real time. And so I think, it's a really challenging dynamic where we know what the solutions look like. We have a toolkit of approaches, and we're grappling with resource challenges that kind of make it necessary to have to partner the engineering approach with the compliance approach as well, and trying to figure out what an equitable compliance team or compliance model looks like. So I think that's the challenge that my teams kind of navigate in real time. And I think another piece to think about that interesting, like given SFMTA's positionality. So we are, San Francisco is a city and county, even though SFMTA operates muni, we're also the Department of Transportation, and we are a department of the city. And so the police department is one of our sister departments. And so, my colleagues and my leaders really navigate a delicate place where, they're hearing the feedback and they're watching the news and understanding the racist outcomes and racial implications of a police first approach. And they're also a little bit reticent, or they move delicately around, providing sharp criticism or sharp supportive feedback to a sister department when, we also have our own piece of the work that we are doing our best and struggling at times to advance at the pace that's necessary to get the work moving. That's the engineering side. So I think that's a delicate balance that's navigated within the city. And I think you kind of see similar dynamics play out in other cities as well. And I think in terms of, you kind of asked, like what has been surfaced, and well, I think I guess I spoke a little bit to the role of a siloed organization, but I think, the challenge both, in San Francisco and in other jurisdictions as well is to kind of not of our work in transportation as a silo, and recognizing that we are charged with, even though like our work is transportation justice nominally, transportation justice looks like, justice in housing, justice in policing, justice in like food justice, justice in homelessness. It looks like justice in all those areas, and you cannot have one without all the others because they're connecting. And so I think, I challenge myself and my colleagues to really think about our responsibility to work towards the equitable outcomes, even if they're not nominally in our scope of work. And so I think that's kind of the challenge of breaking beyond silos and recognizing the responsibility that we have as people that are public servants and that also have access. And I ask all of you, whether you work in a city or not, to be communicating that to your public servants that are accountable and responsible to you, recognizing that, to the extent that they have more access than you do, it is their responsibility to kind of provide that feedback and make sure that they are thinking about things intersectionally and holistically. And so I'll leave that at that for the moment.
Well, speaking of challenges, Tamisha, if you could talk a little bit more about, like you had mentioned some of these incredible challenges that people face in terms of accessing and having power in a process to be able to move things forward, even in communicating with elders in our community that have internalized this idea that police make us safer. But once you dig deeper into it, it gets a little bit, you're able to actually understand what is actually making us safer, something a little bit different than the status quo. I'm curious about what other challenges that you see and how your organization is facing them by bringing people to the table.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And also just I was writing down, I wrote down planning commission because I was like, we need to we need to be talking to our planning commission. I think, you know, there are so many different challenges that come up in our community around issues of safety. And so far, this issue around policing has dominated the conversation. And just as an organizer, somebody who was invested in building deep relationship and power in communities that have been negatively impacted by criminalization, incarceration, white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, nobody gives a damn about all of that, right? Like people are like, what does all of that have to do with my exact experience on the ground today in my community? Because for the most part, a lot of our community aren't in these spaces, right? They aren't in these conversations. They aren't using the same language that we're using. So then when you go out into the community and you're trying to address these issues and build power and help people get involved, right? Get involved and start to make demands on, for instance, what does traffic calming mean in our community? Why don't start questioning why you don't have bike lanes, why you don't have lighted crosswalks, right? Why you don't have signs that say slow, slow down, children, play here. It's really bringing it down to the level of the community and having those real conversations, absent all of the rhetoric and language that we use in these spaces, because for everyday folks, that just doesn't resonate. And so mostly for example, there's a community in Antioch where speeding happens all the time. People don't let their kids out to play. They've tried to petition for speed bumps in the city, traffic calming measures, and they have been told that their streets don't qualify for it, over and over again historically. And so through these conversations in the community, I'm like, well, why your street don't qualify for it? And so then once I asked the question, then they started wondering why as well. So then through some digging and research, it turns out there's nothing in city code or planning that says their street doesn't qualify for traffic calming measures. They've just been lied to for the last 30 years. And they can't let their kids outside to play because of the speeding. Not only do people and individuals speed through there, but police speed through there. So if the very people are supposed, we're saying are supposed to, do traffic enforcement are the violators of those same laws, speeding through communities that already feel unsafe, then that poses an issue. So I think, some of it is just really like getting out in the community, having real conversations, and putting all of the language that kind of goes over people's head aside and just say like, what do we want to see? What do you want to see change? And that is what helps us. Now, of course, we do have to like help people understand processes, procedures, red tape, government, how things are absolutely slow. But then that's when we start to talk about civic engagement and how politically we need to move differently in our communities to get things done. And that, I think that's what's helped people the most. Now, these deeper conversations around like, how do we love each other and protect one another, absent police in our community, those are conversations that we can't have facilitated by whiteness. We also cannot have those conversations in the context of like, history, but in the now. Um, and so I think that's where we've kind of started in Richmond, and we're also trying to have those conversations in different cities similar to Richmond and Contra Costas. Like, how do we have these intergenerational dialogues where we can say like, our elders don't need to be afraid of our young people, and our young people could feel supported by our elders. And then therefore we can all see that the system and structure of policing doesn't actually serve us. It actually goes against our best interest. And we funnel so much money into that system that we don't actually get